3 nannies walked into that mansion believing money could fix anything. All 3 walked out broken by the same crying baby. "I can't do this anymore, Mrs. Whitaker." The 3rd nanny whispered, her voice shaking at the front door. "That child is impossible." And just like that, she left. Inside the massive home in an upscale neighborhood of Chicago, silence lasted only a few seconds. Then the crying started again. Little Ethan Whitaker, only 2 years old, screamed from upstairs with a sound that cut through the walls. It was not an ordinary tantrum. It was not the cry of a spoiled child who wanted attention. It sounded like pain. His mother, Caroline Whitaker, stood frozen in the hallway, her eyes red from sleepless nights. Her husband, Daniel Whitaker, sat in his office with the door closed, staring at his laptop but reading nothing. In less than 2 months, 3 professional nannies had quit. Every one of them said the same thing. "He's impossible." But Ethan was not impossible. He was a beautiful little boy with big wet eyes and tiny hands that reached out as if begging someone to understand him. He cried during meals. He cried in the bath. He cried in the middle of the night until the whole house felt haunted by his suffering. Caroline had paid for specialists. Daniel had paid for expensive tests. Every doctor gave the same answer. "He's healthy. It's just a phase." But inside that house, everyone knew the truth. This was not a phase. This was a child asking for help in the only language he had. Doctors had answers. But none of them had the truth. By the 3rd week, the Whitaker home no longer felt like a home. It felt like a waiting room with marble floors. Every morning, Caroline Whitaker sat beside little Ethan's crib with her hair pulled back in a messy knot and dark circles under her eyes. She would whisper his name again and again, hoping the softness of her voice might reach whatever place inside him was hurting. "Ethan, Mommy's here." But the moment she laid him flat, his tiny body twisted. His back arched. His fists tightened. And then came that cry. Sharp. Broken. Desperate. Downstairs, Daniel Whitaker stood in the kitchen, staring at the untouched bottle of imported formula sitting on the counter. It had cost more than most families spent on groceries in a week. The label was covered in foreign words and promises. Gentle digestion. Advanced nutrition. Trusted by specialists. But Ethan screamed after every feeding. Daniel picked up the bottle, then set it down again with a hard thud. "We've tried everything," he muttered. Caroline looked at him from the doorway, holding their sobbing son against her shoulder. "No," she said, her voice barely holding together. "We've paid for everything." "That's not the same thing." Daniel did not answer. Because deep down he knew she was right. They had taken Ethan to the best pediatricians in the city. Quiet offices with soft music, waiting rooms with white leather chairs. Doctors with calm voices and framed diplomas covering the walls. One doctor checked Ethan's ears. Another pressed gently on his stomach. Another ordered blood work scans, allergy tests, and long reports filled with numbers Daniel could barely understand. Each time, Caroline held her breath. Each time she waited for someone to look at her and say, "Yes, we found it." But they never did. "He's healthy," one doctor said, clicking his pen. "It may be behavioral," another added. "Some children are simply more sensitive. It's a phase. A difficult phase, but still a phase." The words followed them home like a curse. A phase. That was what everyone called it when they did not know what else to say. At night, the mansion glowed under soft yellow lights, beautiful from the street and unbearable inside. Ethan's cries bounced off high ceilings, rolled down the staircase, and slipped under closed doors. Caroline walked the nursery floor until her feet ached. Daniel sat in his office pretending to answer emails while the sound of his son crying cut through him. He would raise the volume on his laptop. Then lower it. Then close the screen completely. There was no hiding from it. Not from the crying. Not from the guilt. Not from the fear that his money, his success, his power meant nothing in the face of his child's suffering. One night Caroline stood over Ethan's crib after another failed feeding. His little face was red. Tears clung to his lashes. His mouth opened in a cry so tired it almost made no sound. She reached down and lifted him. Instantly he pressed against her chest like he was trying to climb out of his own pain. Caroline's chin trembled. "What are you trying to tell me, baby?" she whispered. "Please, help Mommy understand." Daniel appeared at the nursery door. For once he had no phone in his hand. No business call. No excuse. Just a father standing helpless in the doorway of a room he could not fix. Caroline turned toward him, tears shining on her face. "They keep saying he's fine." Daniel swallowed hard. Ethan cried between them, small and exhausted, his tiny body curling and uncurling in Caroline's arms. Daniel stepped closer and touched the back of Ethan's head with 2 fingers as if afraid even his hand might make things worse. "He doesn't sound fine," Daniel said. And there it was. The truth neither of them had dared to say out loud. Their son was not being difficult. He was not trying to punish them. He was not impossible. He was suffering. And somewhere inside that giant expensive house the answer was still hiding. No doctor had found it. No test had named it. No nanny had stayed long enough to notice it. But the crying kept coming. And every cry sounded more and more like a plea. Somebody see me. Somebody understand. Somebody help. Everyone heard Ethan cry. But no one was really listening. By the next morning, the Whittaker mansion moved like a machine running on no sleep. The coffee maker hissed before sunrise. The laundry room hummed. The nursery monitor crackled on the kitchen counter like a warning that never turned off. Upstairs, Ethan Whittaker cried again. Not loud at first. Just a weak broken sound. Then it rose. One breath. Two. Then the scream filled the house. Caroline rushed in before the second cry was finished. She lifted him from the crib, pressing him to her chest, bouncing him gently the way every nurse, every nanny, every parenting book had told her to do. Shh, sweetheart. Shh. Mommy's got you. But Ethan did not calm. His tiny legs kicked. His face twisted. His small hands pushed against her shoulder as if he wanted comfort and could not bear it at the same time. Caroline turned toward the changing table, then the rocking chair, then the bottle warmer glowing in the corner. Every object in that nursery had been bought with hope. The softest blankets. The most expensive crib. The white noise machine. The organic lotions. The special bottles. The imported formula. All of it sat there useless. Downstairs, Daniel stood at the base of the stairs in his pressed shirt, already late for a video meeting. He looked up toward the nursery, jaw tight, one hand gripping his phone. Did he eat? He called. Caroline did not answer right away. She was too busy trying to hold Ethan steady as his little body twisted in her arms. Caroline, Daniel called again. Yes, she shouted back more sharply than she meant to. He ate? A pause. Then maybe he's just tired. The words landed hard. Caroline closed her eyes. Tired. Hungry. Wet. Overstimulated. Spoiled. Difficult. A phase. Everyone had a word for Ethan. No one had an answer. She lowered him carefully onto the changing pad, hoping a fresh diaper might help. The second his back touched the soft cotton cover, Ethan arched so suddenly she almost pulled her hands away. His mouth opened. A raw cry tore out of him. Caroline froze. For 1 second she saw it. Not the crying. The movement before the crying. The way his body fought the position. The way his throat tightened. The way his face looked frightened, not angry. Then panic swallowed the thought. She scooped him up again and rocked harder. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. But nothing was okay. By noon the house had become a battlefield of failed solutions. A warm bath. A clean diaper. A bottle. A pacifier. A lullaby from Caroline's shaking voice. A call to another pediatric office. A message left with another specialist. Daniel came upstairs between meetings, stood in the nursery doorway and watched for less than a minute before frustration took over. Maybe we should hire someone overnight, he said. Caroline turned slowly. Another nanny. Someone more experienced. She'll quit too. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Then what do you want me to do? Caroline looked down at Ethan, whose sobs had softened into exhausted hiccups against her chest. I want someone to look at him, she said. Daniel frowned. Doctors have looked at him. No. Her voice cracked. They checked him. They tested him. They measured him. But they didn't look at him. Daniel said nothing. Because the truth was uncomfortable. Everyone who entered that house had one goal. Stop the crying. Feed him so he stopped. Rock him so he stopped. Bathe him so he stopped. Medicate him so he stopped. Distract him so he stopped. No one asked what the crying meant. Not really. Even Caroline, who loved him more than her own breath, had started measuring the day by silence. 10 quiet minutes felt like a miracle. 20 felt like mercy. She hated herself for it, but exhaustion had changed her prayers. She no longer prayed, please heal him. She prayed, please let him stop crying. That thought nearly broke her. Late that afternoon, Ethan finally fell asleep upright against her shoulder. Caroline did not move. She sat stiff in the nursery chair, afraid even breathing too deeply might wake him. Daniel stepped in quietly. The room was dim. The curtains were half closed. Dust floated through a thin stripe of sunlight across the floor. For the first time all day there was no screaming. Only Ethan's uneven breathing. Daniel looked at his son's tear-streaked face. He looks peaceful, he whispered. Caroline stared at him. No, she said softly. Daniel looked confused. Caroline swallowed. He looks worn out. That was when the housekeeper Grace Miller passed the nursery door with a folded towel in her hands. She did not step inside. She did not speak. But she slowed down. Just enough to hear Ethan's small shaky breath. Just enough to see Caroline holding him upright, afraid to lay him down. Just enough to notice what everyone else had missed. The baby was not fighting them. He was fighting something inside his own body. Grace stood in the hallway silent. And for the first time in that house, someone was not trying to stop Ethan's cry. Someone was trying to understand it. Then came the moment nobody expected. It did not happen in a doctor's office. It did not happen under bright hospital lights. It happened in the quiet hallway outside Ethan's nursery, while Grace Miller stood there holding a stack of folded towels against her chest. She was not supposed to be there for the baby. She had been hired to clean floors, polish counters, scrub bathrooms, and disappear into the background. In houses like the Whitakers' mansion, women like Grace learned quickly where they were allowed to stand and where they were not. The nursery was not her place. The child was not her responsibility. Still, she could not move. From inside the room, Caroline Whitaker whispered, "Please, baby, please sleep." Her voice was worn thin like a thread about to snap. Ethan whimpered against her shoulder. His cries had faded into weak little gasps, but Grace heard something underneath them. A pause. A choke. A tiny swallow that sounded wrong. Grace's fingers tightened around the towels. She knew that sound. Years ago, when her own daughter had been small, Grace had heard that same desperate rhythm in the middle of the night, the crying that came after feeding. The arching back. The stiff little body. The way sleep only came when the child was held upright. Grace leaned slightly toward the open door. Ethan shifted in Caroline's arms. Caroline tried to lay him down. The second his back touched the crib mattress, his whole body changed. His spine bent sharply. His legs pulled up. His face twisted before the cry even came. Then it came. High. Panicked. Full of pain. Caroline gasped and lifted him again. I know. I'm sorry," she whispered, rocking him fast. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." Grace stopped breathing for a second. There it was. Not spoiled. Not stubborn. Not impossible. Pain. And it followed a pattern. Every time Ethan swallowed, his little throat tightened. Every time Caroline laid him flat, his body fought back. Every time he cried after a feeding, it was not anger. It was something burning through him from the inside. Grace looked down at the towels in her arms. She told herself to keep walking. This was not her family. This was not her job. A woman like her could lose everything by saying one sentence in the wrong house. But Ethan cried again, and that cry reached somewhere deep inside her. Not her ears. Her chest. Grace had cleaned mansions before. She had watched rich families argue over wine glasses, over vacation homes, over pillows that did not match the room. She knew how to be invisible. But there was nothing invisible about a child in pain. She stepped closer to the doorway. Caroline turned startled, her eyes swollen and red. Grace. Grace froze. For a moment, the distance between them filled the room. Employer and housekeeper. Wealth and work. A mother who had everything and still could not help her child. Another mother who had almost nothing but recognized suffering when she heard it. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Grace said softly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Caroline shook her head, too exhausted to pretend. "It's fine." Ethan whimpered again. His small hand grabbed at Caroline's shirt, then released. His mouth opened, but only a weak cry came out. Grace watched his face. Then his throat. Then the way Caroline kept him high against her shoulder without even realizing why it helped. Grace swallowed. "Does he always get worse after he eats?" Caroline blinked. The question was simple. Too simple. But it landed in the room like a door opening. "What?" Grace lowered her voice. "After the bottle. Does he cry more? Does he arch his back like that?" Caroline stared at her. For the first time in months, someone had described Ethan instead of judging him. Grace continued carefully, every word measured. "And when he lies flat, does it get worse?" Caroline's lips parted, but no sound came out. Behind her, the expensive nursery was silent except for Ethan's broken breathing. The imported blankets. The designer crib. The soft night light glowing in the corner. All the things money had bought. None of them had noticed. Grace had. Caroline looked down at her son. Then back at Grace. "Yes," she whispered. "Every time." Grace's eyes softened. She wanted to say more. She wanted to tell Caroline what she feared. But the words caught in her throat because she knew her place in that house. So she only said, "I don't think he's trying to cry." Caroline held Ethan tighter. Grace's voice trembled, but she did not look away. "I think something hurts him." For a few seconds nobody moved. Then Ethan let out one small tired sob and rested his cheek against his mother's shoulder. Caroline's face broke. Not from fear this time. From recognition. Because deep down she had known it all along. Her baby was not difficult. Her baby was begging someone to see him. And at last someone finally had. Grace did not learn the sound of pain from books. She learned it at 3 in the morning in a tiny apartment with peeling paint, holding her own little girl while the rest of the world slept. That memory came back so hard she almost had to grip the nursery doorframe. Inside the Whitaker nursery, Caroline stood with Ethan pressed against her shoulder. The baby's cries had softened, but his body was still tight, still fighting something no one could see. Grace watched him the way only a mother watches a child. Not with judgment. With fear. With recognition. Years ago her daughter Lena had cried the same way. Not like a baby asking for attention. Not like a child angry over a bottle or a blanket. It was pain. Real pain. The kind that made a child's whole body curl away from itself. Grace could still remember Lena's small back arching in her arms. The way her little mouth opened after feedings but no comfort came. The way she would finally sleep only when Grace sat upright on the edge of the bed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to lay her down. Doctors had said the same things back then. She's healthy. Some babies cry more. She'll grow out of it. Grace had believed them until she stopped believing her own eyes. Now, standing in this expensive nursery, she saw that same story happening again. Only this time the crib cost more than her monthly rent. The curtains were custom made. The baby monitor had a camera, a speaker, and a glowing app on Caroline's phone. But pain did not care about money. Pain sounded the same in every house. Ethan made a tiny choking sound. Grace's heart clenched. Caroline looked at her waiting. Not like an employer waiting for a worker to speak. Like a mother begging another mother to say the thing she was too scared to believe. "You've heard this before," Caroline whispered. Grace looked down. For a second she wanted to step back into safety. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't." "No." Caroline's voice cracked. "Please. Tell me." The room went still. Downstairs, somewhere far away, a phone rang once and stopped. The air conditioner hummed softly. Ethan breathed in short, uneven pulls against his mother's shoulder. Grace slowly stepped into the nursery. "Not too far. Just enough. My daughter cried like that," she said. "When she was little?" Caroline's face changed. Grace kept her voice low, gentle, careful. "People said she was fussy. Said I was holding her too much. Said I didn't know what I was doing because I was young." She swallowed. "But I knew. I knew something was hurting her." Ethan whimpered again, and Grace's eyes moved to him immediately. That was the difference. Everyone else reacted to the noise. Grace watched the child. She saw the tiny swallow. The tight throat. The way his body settled only while upright. The way his face tightened before the cry came out, as if he already knew what pain was coming. Caroline followed Grace's gaze. For the first time she was not just holding Ethan, she was studying him. Grace spoke softly. "That cry right there, that isn't anger." Caroline's eyes filled. Grace took another breath. "And it isn't bad behavior." Ethan's fingers curled weakly against Caroline's shirt. Grace's voice trembled now, but she did not stop. "That is a baby asking for help." Caroline closed her eyes and a tear slid down her cheek. For months she had heard people call her son difficult. Impossible. Too sensitive. Spoiled by attention. Even she had started fearing those words might be true. But hearing Grace say it, hearing another mother named, the pain broke something open inside her. Caroline looked down at Ethan's wet lashes. "Oh my baby," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Grace wanted to comfort her, but she stayed still. She knew grief needed room. So did guilt. Then Caroline looked up. "What did you do for your daughter?" Grace's hands tightened in front of her. "I learned to listen to what her body was doing," she said. "Not just what people told me it meant." The sentence landed deep. Because that was exactly what had been missing in that house. Not money. Not effort. Not love. Listening. Ethan shifted in Caroline's arms, letting out one exhausted sob. Caroline adjusted him higher, instinctively keeping him upright. Grace noticed. Caroline noticed that Grace noticed. And suddenly the silence between them felt different. It was not the silence of a mansion full of helpless people. It was the first quiet moment after someone finally understood. Grace stepped back toward the hallway, remembering her place. But Caroline stopped her. "Grace." The housekeeper paused. Caroline's voice was barely above a whisper. "Please don't go." Grace looked at the baby, then at the broken mother holding him. And in that moment, she was no longer just the woman hired to clean. She was the first person in that house to hear Ethan's cry for what it truly was. Grace knew one wrong sentence could cost her everything. Not just the job. The rent. The groceries. The quiet dignity of being able to go home at night and say she had earned her place in the world. So when Caroline Whitaker asked her not to leave the nursery, Grace stayed frozen in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes lowered out of habit. In houses like this, there were rules no one had to say out loud. Housekeepers did not give opinions. Housekeepers did not question doctors. Housekeepers did not tell rich mothers what might be wrong with their babies. Grace had learned that the hard way. She had cleaned homes where people spoke over her, like she was furniture. Homes where women left jewelry on counters just to see if it disappeared. Homes where men gave orders without looking up from their phones. So she stood there, heart pounding, while Ethan whimpered against his mother's shoulder. Caroline looked desperate. "Grace, please?" That one word changed the air. Please? Not a command. Not an order. A plea from one mother to another. Grace slowly lifted her eyes. Ethan's little cheek was pressed against Caroline's robe. His eyelashes were wet. His breathing came in tiny broken pulls, like even resting took effort. Grace took one small step into the room. Then another. "I don't want to overstep," she said softly. Caroline gave a shaky laugh that was almost a sob. Overstep. She looked around the nursery at the expensive crib, the untouched bottles, the stack of medical papers on the dresser. "Grace, everyone who was supposed to know what to do has already been here." Her voice broke. "And my baby is still suffering." Grace swallowed hard. Downstairs, a door opened. Daniel's voice drifted up from the hallway. He was on the phone again, calm and polished, the voice of a man who could control companies, contracts, and grown men in expensive suits. But not this. Never this. Grace heard his footsteps move away. Her fear returned fast. What if he walked in? What if he heard her? What if he thought she was pretending to know more than doctors? She imagined his face tightening. His voice going cold. The words coming sharp. "We hired you to clean, Grace." Her stomach twisted. Because she needed this job. But then Ethan made that sound again. A tiny choke after a swallow. Grace's whole body reacted before her mind could stop it. She moved closer. "May I see how you're holding him?" she asked. Caroline nodded immediately. Grace did not touch Ethan at first. She only stood beside them watching. She watched his throat, his mouth, his back. The way his body relaxed slightly when Caroline kept him upright. "Try lifting him a little higher," Grace said. Caroline adjusted him. Ethan's crying softened. Just a little. But in that room a little felt like thunder. Caroline's eyes widened. Grace saw it too. The smallest pause. The first crack in months of helplessness. Then Ethan shifted and Caroline instinctively began to lower him toward the crib. Grace's voice came out before she could stop it. "No, wait." Caroline froze. So did Grace. The word hung in the nursery. Too direct. Too bold. Too dangerous. Grace immediately stepped back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean..." But Caroline was not angry. She was staring at Ethan. Because the moment she stopped lowering him, the baby's body loosened again. Caroline looked up at Grace, tears spilling freely now. "You saw that?" Grace nodded barely. "Yes. What is it?" Grace pressed her lips together. This was the line. Once she crossed it, she could not take it back. She thought of her daughter Lena, small and crying in the dark. She thought of all the times she had stayed silent because people with nicer clothes made her feel small. She thought of Ethan trapped in a pain no one had named. Then Grace made her choice. She stepped fully into the nursery. Her voice trembled but her eyes stayed steady. "I'm not a doctor," she said. "And I know I'm only here to clean." Caroline shook her head, crying harder. "Please just say it." Grace looked at Ethan. Then she said the truth as gently as she could. "I think he's trying to tell you something with his body." Caroline held her breath. Grace continued. "Every time he lies flat, he hurts. Every time he swallows, he struggles. Every time he eats, the crying gets worse." Ethan gave one soft, tired sob. Grace's voice dropped. "That's not a spoiled baby, Mrs. Whitaker." She paused. "That's a baby in pain." For a long moment the nursery was silent. No machines. No doctors. No expensive advice. Just two mothers standing over one suffering child. And Grace, the woman hired to clean the floors, had done the one thing no one else had been brave enough to do. She spoke. The moment Grace spoke, the room changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough for Caroline Whitaker to stop moving. She stood in the middle of Ethan's nursery, with her baby pressed against her chest, tears sliding down her face, while Grace Miller stood a few feet away, terrified she had just said too much. For a second neither woman breathed. Then Ethan whimpered. His tiny body tightened again and Caroline instinctively adjusted him higher on her shoulder. The crying softened. Grace noticed it. Caroline noticed Grace noticing it. And in that tiny silence something finally made sense. "Show me," Caroline whispered. Grace blinked. "What?" "Show me what you mean?" Grace's eyes widened. "Mrs. Whitaker, I don't think I should hold him." Caroline shook her head quickly, almost desperately. "You said it hurts him when he lies down. You saw something. Please?" Grace looked toward the hallway. At any moment Daniel could come upstairs. At any moment he could see the housekeeper holding his son and decide she had crossed a line she could never uncross. But then Ethan cried again. Small, weak, exhausted. Grace's fear became smaller than his pain. She stepped forward slowly and held out her arms. Caroline hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then she placed Ethan into Grace's hands. The baby was warm, damp with sweat, lighter than Grace expected but heavy with suffering. Grace pulled him gently against her shoulder, supporting his back with one hand and the base of his head with the other. She did not bounce him. She did not shush him loudly, she did not rush, she only held him upright. Still. Steady. Close. "Hi, sweetheart," Grace whispered near his ear. I know it hurts." Ethan's crying hitched once. Then slowed. Caroline froze. Grace shifted him just a little higher, keeping his chest lifted, his head resting safely near her shoulder. "That's it," Grace murmured. "You don't have to fight so hard." Ethan made one tiny sound, almost like a sigh. Then the room went quiet. Not completely. There was still the soft hum of the air conditioner, the faint tick of the nursery clock, Caroline's shaky breathing. But the screaming stopped. For the first time that day, Ethan was not arching, twisting, or pushing away from comfort. He rested. His little hand opened against Grace's blouse. Caroline covered her mouth with both hands. "Oh my God," she whispered. Grace did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply kept holding the baby, her face calm, her arms steady, like she had been carrying children through pain her whole life. Ethan's eyelids fluttered. His breath, still uneven, began to settle into a slower rhythm. Caroline took one step closer, afraid the silence might break if she moved too fast. "How are you doing that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Grace looked down at Ethan's cheek resting against her shoulder. "I'm not doing anything special," she said softly. "I'm just keeping him where his body feels safer." Caroline's eyes filled again. Safer. That word nearly broke her. Because for months she had given Ethan everything beautiful, everything expensive, everything recommended. But not this. Not the simple position his body had been begging for. Grace turned slightly so Caroline could see him. "Watch his face," she said. Caroline leaned in. Ethan swallowed. Usually that tiny movement came before another wave of crying. This time he only tightened for a second, then relaxed again. Grace nodded gently. "See, upright helps him." Caroline stared at her son as if she were seeing him for the first time. Not as a problem. Not as a mystery. As a child giving clues. His body had been speaking all along. They had just been too scared, too tired, too focused on silence to understand the language. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway. Daniel appeared at the nursery door, phone in hand, irritation still on his face from whatever call he had just ended. He stopped. His eyes moved from Caroline's tear-streaked face to Grace standing in the middle of the nursery holding his son. "What is going on?" he asked. The question was cold. Grace's shoulders tightened. Caroline quickly stepped forward. "Daniel, wait." But Daniel barely heard her. His eyes stayed on Grace. "Why are you holding my child?" Grace opened her mouth but no words came out. Ethan stirred against her shoulder. Everyone froze. 1 second passed. 2. 3. No scream. Daniel's expression shifted. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, he looked at his son and did not hear crying. He only saw Ethan resting quietly against the housekeeper's shoulder. Caroline whispered. He stopped. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. Grace stood perfectly still, as if one wrong breath might ruin everything. Caroline wiped her face with the back of her hand. She held him upright, she said. And he stopped. Daniel looked at Ethan again. His tiny cheek pressed into Grace's shoulder. His little mouth relaxed. His hand open. Quiet. Peaceful. Exhausted but peaceful. Daniel had paid every expert he could find. He had trusted every expensive answer. And now, in the soft light of his son's nursery, the first real relief had come from the woman hired to clean their floors. He did not know what to say. No one did. Then Ethan's sigh hid in his sleep. A tiny sound. Almost nothing. But to Caroline it sounded like hope. And for the first time in that broken house, hope had a heartbeat. Daniel stood in the doorway, staring like the whole room had turned against everything he believed. His son was quiet. Not fixed. Not healed. But quiet. And that silence shook him more than the crying ever had. Grace Miller stood in the center of the nursery, holding Ethan Whitaker upright against her shoulder. Her arms were steady but her heart was pounding. She could feel Daniel's eyes on her. Cold, confused, protective, maybe angry. Caroline wiped her tears quickly, stepping between them without even realizing it. "Daniel, listen to me," she said. Grace noticed something. Daniel frowned. She noticed something. His voice carried the weight of every doctor's bill, every specialist's appointment, every sleepless night he had tried to solve with money. Grace lowered her gaze. "I'm not trying to interfere, sir." Ethan stirred against her shoulder. Everyone stopped. Grace held him a little higher, gently supporting his chest. Ethan swallowed. His small face tightened for a second, but the scream did not come. Caroline pointed softly. "There." Did you see that? Daniel looked. Grace took a careful breath. Every time he swallows he struggles, she said. And when he lies flat, it gets worse. Daniel's jaw tightened. Grace knew that look. It was the look people gave when they were deciding whether she had spoken out of place. So she made her voice even softer. I'm not a doctor. I know that. But I've seen this before. Caroline turned toward her. With your daughter. Grace nodded. A shadow crossed her face. My little girl Maya cried like this when she was a baby. Everyone said she was fussy. They said I was nervous. They said new mothers worry too much. She looked down at Ethan. But she wasn't fussy. She was hurting. Daniel crossed his arms, but he did not interrupt. That was something. Grace continued. After she ate, she would cry like something was burning inside her. If I laid her down, she would arch her back and scream. But if I held her upright, she gently shifted Ethan again. She could breathe easier. She could rest. Caroline's face crumpled. That's exactly what he does. Grace nodded slowly. I think, maybe you should ask a doctor to check for severe reflux. The word hung in the air. Reflux. So small. So ordinary. But to Caroline it sounded like the first real answer she had heard in months. Daniel blinked. Reflux, he repeated. We asked about feeding issues. They said he was fine. Grace looked at him for the first time. Not boldly. Not disrespectfully. Just honestly. Sometimes fine on paper doesn't mean fine in his body, sir. Daniel looked away. That sentence hit harder than she meant it to. Caroline moved closer to Ethan, touching his tiny foot. Could reflux make him cry like this? Grace swallowed. It can hurt. A lot. Especially when they lie down. It can feel like burning in the throat, like they're trying to swallow something that keeps coming back up. Caroline covered her mouth. Because suddenly every night made sense. Every feeding. Every bath. Every time Ethan had screamed the second his back touched the crib mattress. Daniel's face changed slowly as if his mind was replaying months of memories he had been too tired to understand. The bottle. The arching. The choking sounds. The way Ethan calmed only when someone held him against a shoulder. Grace gently rocked once, barely moving. I'm not saying that's what it is for sure, she said. I'm only saying, his body keeps showing the same signs, Caroline whispered. And nobody saw it. Grace's eyes softened. You saw it, ma'am? You just needed someone to say it out loud. That broke Caroline. She turned away, pressing both hands to her face as a silent sob ran through her shoulders. Daniel watched his wife. Then his son. Then Grace. The woman he had barely noticed since she entered their house. The woman hired to clean fingerprints off glass. Now she was standing there with his child resting against her shoulder, offering the first explanation that did not make Ethan sound like a problem. Daniel's voice came out lower. What should we do? Grace looked surprised. For the first time he was not dismissing her. He was asking. Caroline turned back immediately. We call the pediatrician. Daniel nodded, once already reaching for his phone. No, Caroline said, stronger now. Not just a call. We take him in. Today. And we ask them directly. Daniel looked at Ethan, still quiet in Grace's arms. Then he nodded again. Okay? Grace carefully placed Ethan back into Caroline's arms, keeping him upright as she passed him over. Caroline held him close. This time she did not bounce him. She did not panic. She listened to his body. Ethan breathed softly against her chest. Grace stepped back toward the door. But before she could leave, Caroline caught her hand. Thank you, she whispered. Grace looked at Ethan. Then, at Caroline. And for the first time since she entered that mansion, she did not feel invisible. She felt heard. Daniel did not shout at first. That almost made it worse. He stood in Ethan's nursery with his phone in one hand, staring at Grace Miller as if she had stepped into a room where she had no right to breathe. A housekeeper, he said quietly. Caroline turned toward him. Daniel. He shook his head, his eyes still fixed on Grace. We paid specialists. Pediatricians, people with medical degrees, people who trained for years. His voice hardened. And now we're supposed to believe Grace saw what they didn't. Grace lowered her eyes. The words hit exactly where he meant them to. She had known this moment would come. The moment when compassion would be treated like arrogance. The moment when her place in the house would be reminded to her with a smile, a look, or a sentence sharp enough to cut. Caroline held Ethan upright against her chest. His breathing was still soft, still calmer than it had been all morning. That's not what she said, Caroline replied. She said we should ask a doctor to check. Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. Oh, come on, Caroline. You're exhausted. We both are. But this, he gestured toward Grace. This is not a diagnosis. Grace stepped back. You're right, sir, she said softly. It isn't. Daniel looked at her, surprised she had answered. I only noticed a pattern, Grace continued. That's all. A pattern. Yes, sir. Daniel's jaw tightened. And where did you learn to recognize patterns? Medical school, Caroline flinched. Grace did not. She had been spoken to like that before. In kitchens. In laundry rooms. In hallways where people forgot she had ears and a heart, but this time a baby was involved. So she swallowed her fear. My daughter, Grace said. Daniel went quiet. Grace kept her voice steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. When she was little, she cried after feedings. She arched her back. She struggled when I laid her down. I was told the same things Mrs. Whittaker was told. That she was fine. That it was a phase. She looked at Ethan. But she wasn't fine. Caroline's arms tightened around her son. Daniel looked away. He did not want this to make sense. That was the ugly truth. Because if Grace was right, then money had failed him. His confidence had failed him. His carefully chosen experts had missed something a woman in a cleaning uniform had noticed in a single morning. And Daniel Whittaker did not know how to live inside that kind of humiliation. So he reached for anger. We are not making medical decisions based on a coincidence. Caroline's eyes flashed. This is our son. I know that. Do you? The room went still. Even Grace looked up. Caroline's voice trembled, but it did not break. Because every time he cries, you leave the room. Daniel's face changed. That's not fair. No, Caroline said. None of this is fair. But it's true. Daniel took a step back as if she had slapped him. Caroline's tears spilled over now, but she kept going. I have watched him suffer for months. I have watched doctors shrug. I have watched nannies quit. I have watched you disappear into phone calls because you can't stand not being able to fix this. Daniel's lips parted, but no defense came. Caroline looked down at Ethan's tired face. And today someone finally looked at him long enough to notice that he hurts when he lies down. Grace stood silent near the door, wishing she could vanish. But Caroline was not finished. I don't care if Grace learned it in a hospital, in a classroom, or holding her own child at 3 in the morning. She saw him. Daniel stared at his wife. Then at Grace. Then at the baby. Ethan stirred. A tiny swallow moved through his throat. His face tightened, his legs pulled slightly upward, and Caroline instinctively lifted him higher against her shoulder. The cry did not come. Daniel saw it. Really saw it. For the first time, he did not hear a problem to be silenced. He saw a child fighting pain. His anger faltered. But pride is a stubborn thing. It does not die all at once. Daniel rubbed his forehead and whispered, "What if we go in there and they laugh at us?" Caroline's expression softened, but her answer was firm. "Then we ask again." Grace looked at her. Something had changed in Caroline. The exhausted mother who had whispered helpless prayers in the nursery was still there, but now there was steel beneath the pain. Daniel looked down at his phone. A list of missed calls. Emails. Meetings. All the things that usually made him feel important. None of them mattered. Not while his son was breathing like that. Not while his wife was looking at him like she needed him to be a father more than a powerful man. Grace spoke one last time, barely above a whisper. "Sir, I'm not asking you to believe me over a doctor." Daniel lifted his eyes. "I'm asking you to believe your son." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Daniel looked at Ethan. The little boy's cheek rested against Caroline's shoulder. His lashes were wet. His hand opened and closed weakly, as if even peace felt unfamiliar. Daniel's shoulders dropped. The fight went out of him. Slowly, he nodded. "Get his bag," he said. Caroline blinked. Daniel swallowed hard. "We're taking him in?" Grace exhaled softly, almost silently. Caroline closed her eyes for one brief second, holding Ethan tighter. It was not a victory. Not yet. But it was the first time Daniel had stopped defending his pride long enough to follow the truth. And in that mansion, that was the beginning of everything. Caroline moved through the nursery like a woman waking from a long nightmare. Not healed. Not safe yet. But awake. She laid Ethan's diaper bag on the changing table and began packing with shaking hands. Bottles. Wipes. A clean blanket. The little blue sweater he wore on cold mornings. Every item went in quickly, but her mind was somewhere else. It was replaying one sentence. "You saw it, ma'am. You just needed someone to say it out loud." Grace's words would not leave her. For months, Caroline Whittaker had doubted herself. Every time a doctor smiled gently and told her Ethan was healthy, she had nodded like a good mother should. Every time someone said, "Some babies just cry," she had forced herself to believe it. Every time another nanny quit and called her son impossible, a tiny piece of her confidence cracked. Maybe she was too emotional. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe she was turning normal baby crying into a disaster because she could not handle motherhood the way other women did. That was the cruelest part. The world had not only failed to understand Ethan, It had made Caroline question the one thing that should have been strongest inside her. Her instinct. Now Ethan rested upright against her shoulder, his cheek warm against her collarbone. He still made little sounds when he swallowed, but Caroline noticed them differently now. Not as random cries. As clues. She lifted him higher before the discomfort could build. His body relaxed a little. Caroline froze. There it was again. The pattern. She had seen it hundreds of times, but she had never trusted herself enough to name it. Across the room, Daniel zipped the emergency bag too hard, fumbling with the zipper until it caught. "Where are his insurance cards?" he asked. "Top drawer," Caroline said. Her voice was steady. Daniel looked at her. For months he had heard her tired voice, her broken voice, her pleading voice. This was different. Soft yes. Exhausted yes. But steady. He opened the drawer and pulled out the cards. "I'll call ahead." "No," Caroline said. Daniel paused. She looked at him, Ethan held firmly upright in her arms. "We're not calling and letting someone tell us to wait until next week. We're going now." Daniel stared at her, surprised. Caroline did not look away. "And when we get there, we're going to tell them exactly what we've seen. The swallowing, the arching, the crying after feeding. The way lying flat makes it worse." Daniel nodded slowly. "Okay. And if they say it's a phase again," she continued, her voice tightening, "we ask for someone else?" Grace stood near the doorway silent, one hand pressed against the front of her uniform. Caroline turned to her. "You said something earlier," Caroline whispered. "That a mother knows." Grace's eyes softened. "I said a mother knows when something is wrong." Caroline swallowed hard. For one brief second, the mansion, the money, the distance between them, none of it mattered. There were only two women in a nursery standing on the same side of a child's pain. "I stopped trusting that," Caroline said. Grace shook her head gently. "No, ma'am. You were just tired. Tired can make the truth sound far away." Caroline's face crumpled, but she did not fall apart. Not this time. She looked down at Ethan. His tiny fingers curled against her blouse. His eyelashes were still wet. His breathing was fragile but calmer. "I knew," she whispered. "I knew he wasn't just difficult." Daniel heard it. And this time he did not correct her. He stepped closer, his pride quieter now, his face heavy with regret. "I should have listened to you," he said. Caroline looked up. The apology was small. But in that room it mattered. Daniel reached toward Ethan, then stopped, unsure if touching him would disturb the calm. Caroline saw the hesitation and shifted closer so he could place his hand gently on their son's back. Ethan stirred. Daniel stiffened. But Caroline lifted Ethan slightly higher, just as Grace had shown her. The baby settled again. Daniel's eyes filled. He looked at Caroline as if he finally understood the language she had been speaking for months. "You know what he needs," he said quietly. Caroline shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't know everything." Then she held Ethan closer. "But I know he's hurting." Grace lowered her eyes, fighting her own tears. Caroline turned to her again. "Will you come with us?" Grace blinked. "Me?" "Yes." Daniel looked surprised, but he said nothing. Caroline's voice was firm now. "You saw what we missed. I want you there." Grace's lips parted. For a moment, she looked like she might refuse, like the old fear was pulling her back into the hallway where she was supposed to stay invisible. Then Ethan made a soft, tired sound. Grace stepped forward. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I'll come." Caroline nodded, breathing out slowly. Then she picked up the diaper bag, held Ethan upright against her chest, and walked toward the stairs. Not helpless anymore. Not silent anymore. Behind her came Daniel, carrying the medical papers that had never told the whole story. Behind him came Grace, the woman who had dared to say what everyone else had missed. And for the first time in months, Caroline did not walk like a mother chasing answers. She walked like a mother ready to fight for one. The hospital bag was packed. The car keys were in Daniel's hand. Caroline stood at the top of the staircase with Ethan upright against her chest, ready to leave. And then everything stopped. Ethan made a sound so small most people would have missed it. A tiny swallow. A tight breath. A soft wounded whimper that slipped into Caroline's neck. Grace heard it. Caroline heard it too. The baby's body stiffened. His back started to arch. Caroline lifted him higher, just like Grace had shown her, but this time Ethan did not settle. His face tightened. His tiny mouth opened and a weak cry came out. Not the loud scream from before. Something thinner. More tired. More frightening. Daniel stepped closer. "What's wrong?" Caroline looked down at their son, panic rising in her eyes again. "I don't know." Grace moved beside her, careful but quick. She watched Ethan's throat. Watched his lips. Watched the way he swallowed again, then twisted as if something inside him burned. "He's getting tired," Grace said softly. Daniel's grip tightened around the keys. "Then we go. Now." But as Caroline took one step down, Ethan cried harder. His tiny body jerked against her. She froze on the stairs, terrified to move him, terrified not to. Grace's face changed. Not fear. Decision. Mrs. Whittaker, she said, keep him upright. Don't lay him back. Not even in the car seat if he gets worse. Daniel turned sharply. He has to be in a car seat. I know, sir, Grace said. I'm not saying don't use it. I'm saying watch him. Watch how he reacts. Tell the doctor everything. Caroline nodded quickly, but her hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped the diaper bag. Grace reached for it. I'll carry this. Daniel looked at her, still uncertain, still fighting the last pieces of pride. But Ethan cried again, and pride had no place left to stand. Fine, he said. Let's move. They reached the front hall. The mansion looked perfect around them. Polished floors, tall windows, fresh flowers on the entry table, a house built to impress anyone who walked through the door. But that morning none of it mattered. Not the money. Not the furniture. Not the walls high enough to echo a child's pain for months. Caroline stopped near the front door, holding Ethan tighter. Grace noticed her staring at nothing. Ma'am? Caroline blinked. I'm scared they won't listen. Daniel looked at her. Grace stepped closer. Then make them listen. Caroline's eyes filled. Grace lowered her voice. You know what you saw. You know what he does after feeding. You know what happens when he lies flat. Don't let anyone turn that into just crying. The words landed deep. Caroline nodded, but Grace could see she was still unraveling. So Grace did something small. Something quiet. Something that would change everything later. She pulled a paper towel from the kitchen counter near the hall. Her hands moved quickly, almost nervously. She took a pen from beside the house phone and began writing. Daniel opened the front door. Grace, we need to go. 1 second, sir. She kept writing. Caroline watched her. Grace wrote every detail she had noticed, because exhausted mothers forget when doctors speak too fast. Fear can erase words. Panic can blur timelines. But paper stays steady. Cries after feeding. Swallows hard. Seems to choke or gag. Arches back when lying flat. Calms more when held upright. Please ask them to check for severe reflux. Grace folded the paper once and pressed it into Caroline's hand. Caroline looked down at it. What is this? Just in case your voice shakes, Grace said. Give them this. Caroline stared at the note like it was something sacred. For months she had carried fear in her chest with no shape and no name. Now in her hand was a list, a pattern, a beginning. Daniel looked at the paper, then at Grace. He said nothing. But his face softened. Ethan whimpered again, his cheek pressed against Caroline's shoulder. Caroline brought the note to her chest for 1 second, holding it beside her son. Thank you, she whispered. Grace nodded. No speech. No grain moment. Just a housekeeper standing in the doorway of a rich family's mansion, giving a mother the words she needed to fight for her child. Then they stepped outside. The morning air was cool. The car waited in the driveway. Daniel opened the back door. Caroline lowered herself carefully, keeping Ethan as upright as she could while settling him in. Grace climbed in beside her, diaper bag on her lap, eyes never leaving the baby. Daniel got behind the wheel. For the first time, he did not ask another expert to handle it. He drove. Caroline held the folded note in one hand and Ethan's tiny fingers in the other. And as the mansion disappeared behind them, she felt something she had not felt in months. Not peace. Not yet. But direction. A reason. A name to ask for. And sometimes when a child has been suffering in silence, one handwritten note is the first sound of rescue. The ride to the hospital felt longer than any road they had ever taken. In the back seat, Caroline Whittaker held the folded note in one hand and Ethan's tiny fingers in the other. His cries came in weak waves now. Not loud, not angry, just tired, too tired. Daniel drove faster than usual, but for once he did not speak into a phone. He did not take a call. He did not try to control the moment with money or status. He only kept looking in the rearview mirror. Stay with us, buddy, he whispered. Beside Caroline, Grace Miller watched Ethan closely. Keep him upright, she said gently. You're doing good. Caroline nodded through tears. At the hospital, Daniel carried the diaper bag while Caroline rushed through the doors with Ethan against her chest. A nurse stepped forward. What brings you in today? Caroline's voice shook. Then she remembered the note. She unfolded it and handed it over. He cries after feeding. He struggles when he swallows. He arches when he lies flat. He calms when he's upright. Her breath broke. Please check him for severe reflux. The nurse looked at the paper. Then, at Ethan. This time no one dismissed it. This time no one called him difficult. Within minutes Ethan was being examined. Caroline stood beside the bed, one hand on his foot, whispering, Mommy's here. Mommy's right here. Daniel stood behind her, silent, shaken, finally understanding how many cries had been asking for help. Grace stayed near the wall, quiet as always. But Caroline turned back and reached for her hand. "No," she said softly. "Stay close." Grace stepped forward. And in that moment the distance between them disappeared. Not rich woman and housekeeper. Not employer and employee. Just two mothers who had listened to a child when the world had not. Later, when the doctor began discussing reflux and treatment options, Caroline closed her eyes and cried. Not from fear this time. From relief. Because Ethan had not been impossible. He had been in pain. And the person who helped them see it was not the one with the most money, the biggest title, or the longest list of degrees. It was the woman brave enough to care. Sometimes the truth does not come from the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it comes from the quiet person standing in the hallway noticing what everyone else ignored. Never look down on someone because of their job, their clothes, their background, or their place in society. Wisdom can live in humble hands. Compassion can see what pride misses. And sometimes the person others treat as invisible is the very person God uses to bring the answer. Ethan's story reminds us of something powerful. Love is not just feeling. Love is attention. Love is listening. Love is having the courage to speak when staying silent would be easier. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Have you ever seen someone underestimated only to become the person who saved the day? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that remind us what humanity still means.